Hello. This is a video about my post-processing workflow and the products that I use in it. It's a video about processing single images. I do sometimes use multiple images, for example for focus stacking or panoramas, but I use different products and different workflow for those, and I'm not going to be talking about those in this video. This is very much about my image processing at this particular point in time. I keep experimenting with these things and I keep changing the products that I use and the processes that I use with them. So your mileage may well vary. What will work for you may be very different from what works for me, but there may be some ideas in this that are useful anyway. I hope so. Each of us has to work out for ourselves what products to use and how to use them, and it depends upon your particular circumstances, your needs, your preferences. And in my case, here are some things that influence my choices. I shoot RAW. I have large numbers of photos to deal with. I typically have several hundred in a day, and I may have over 1,000. I often have a high failure rate. This is when I'm photographing insects, spiders and so on. And sometimes I don't have a high failure rate for some sequences, but if it does work, because I take a lot of pictures of an individual subject, there may be a number which work more or less okay, and I'm then left with the problem of, okay, so which of these am I going to use? So I have things which are almost complete duplicates, but not quite. I don't use cataloguing of the sort that, for example, Lightroom and other products provides. I like to use the straightforward Windows file system. I don't use keywords and so on. And as far as the image quality goes, for me, especially with insects and spiders, the fine detail that I can get out of the images is very important indeed. Because of the way I capture the photos, quite often there are issues to do with highlights and shadows. And one of the cameras that I use, the one that I use almost all the time for insects and spiders when I'm using flash, that camera is very noisy, and so handling noise is important to me. And also I'm aiming to produce outputs which are 1300 pixels high on the screen. That's what my target. I'm trying to get the best I can for that output. So all these factors play into my choice of products and the workflow that I use. Here is the main outline of my workflow. Now look, this is fairly complicated, and you may well want a simpler arrangement. That's fine, but I'm going to go through the whole of my own workflow so that those who are interested can see what's involved in producing my pictures. First I have to get the pictures, the images off of the camera and onto my PC, and straight away I make a backup. I then may do this rubbish culling. I may have a very quick run through and throw out all the ones that are obviously not going to be usable. I'm going to go through each of these stages in more detail later. I then do global adjustments which affect the whole image, and that includes the raw conversion. I may then do local adjustments where just part of the image is being changed in one way or another. When I finish that, I produce JPEGs. Up to that point I'm not working with JPEGs. And I do quality assurance on the images And while I'm doing the global adjustments and the local adjustments, I'm doing selection along the way. And in this stage of image quality assurance and final selection, I may decide that some of them, even though I've been making selections earlier, that some of them I don't want to use after all because I don't think they're good enough, or because they're too similar to some other image that I've chosen. And then at the end I have to do some bureaucracy, organize things, make another backup copy, upload there's a backup copy of the final versions and of the raw files that are associated with the images that I've decided to keep, and I upload to Flickr. And now we can go through the workflow step by step. The first thing is to get the images off of the camera. So I put the memory card into a USB reader, and I use Faststone Image Viewer, and I simply use its download photos facility, which is set up that all the images will go into a folder under the current month with the date in there. So I just, there's hardly any actually on this particular card, but I just say start and it downloads them. Once I've downloaded them, I end up with a set of raw files in a directory like this one, and I may add something to the date just to give me some idea about what's in the directory. We can see here that they're organized by year, by month, and then by date. This is the way the files are organized before I've processed them. As we'll see, there's a different organization when I've finished processing them. So I now need to do this rubbish culling if I'm going to do it. And my preference here is to use Faststone because I can do it really fast in Faststone. Here I've got a set of raw files, and going through them in Faststone is really pretty quick because Faststone, I've got it set up so it's looking at the embedded JPEG images, and quite often this is good enough for me to do this first selection. So what I do is to go through, and if I think something may be okay, I just I've got my finger on the / key, and I think, well, that might be okay, and up at the top here we can see a little marker comes up, and I can go through quite fast, not selecting that, and then select that one, not that one, it's out of focus, not that one, it's not quite in, that one's definitely out of focus, and I've done it the wrong way round. And so if I think it might be okay, I mark it up, there's one, and on we go. So I end up with some images which I think may be okay, and I then select them all and make a new directory and stick them in there. So for example, if we look at another set here, I've got these selected raw ones, so these are ones that I would have marked up and then copied in, and there are quite a lot of them of the selected ones. Now I've been doing that in Faststone, but sometimes I might do it in Lightroom and very occasionally in Silky Pics. So if we have a look in Lightroom, I've got this set of raw files, and it may be, and the reason I may be using Lightroom is that a lot of them are either too bright or too dark, and I'm having difficulty working out which ones I'm going to throw out. So what I can do is select them all. I won't in fact select them all at the moment, I'll just select one or two, and I can use this auto tone on them, which will bring the brightness up to a more or less suitable level. I might actually take it down by 2/3 of a stop as well. after having done the auto tone, because I find that the auto tone makes it rather bright. But I'm just trying to get it to a brightness where I can see better what's going on, and imagine that I've done this for all 300 or 600 or however many of them there are, at which point I can then go through. I'll just turn those back. I'll undo them like that. So imagine now that I've possibly done auto tone on all of them, and I can go through them, and this time if I'm in Lightroom doing this, I'll just going backwards. It's slower while it's loading things up. I'll choose the ones that I do want to use. Oh, that's because I'm going round and round with the 3 that I've selected. Try that again. Start with the first one. So I go through, and if I want to select one of them, say, well, that may be usable, I mark them up with a colour, which I can do by pressing one of the number keys. So I've just set that to red, for example, and I go through, and if I like the look of it, I'll set it to red, and if I don't, I won't. And so I go on through looking for ones that might be okay, and I need to wait till it's come up to see whether it's okay or not. That one's out of focus. That one, no, I don't think so. That one definitely not. That one, yeah, that may be okay. So, and this is operating a bit slower at the moment because I've got so many things loaded at one time. Then I can select the ones that are a particular colour by selecting on the attribute, and now I've got all the ones that are red, and I can now, I want to put those somewhere else or make copies of them, and so I can export them, and I'll choose the image format to be the original, and put them in a separate folder. We'll see in just a moment why I want to put them into a separate folder. And if I wanted to, I could do a similar thing in Silky Pics, although I find that Lightroom's better than this this particular exercise than Silky Pics is. The next step is to do the global adjustments, the changes to the images that affect the whole image, and that includes the raw conversion. And I've got it down to 2 possibilities here. In both cases I use DxO Optics Pro 10 first, and then I use either Silky Pics or Lightroom. Let's look at the using DxO first. Here I've got a set of images in DxO, and I can select them all with one keystroke, and now I can apply a preset to them. I apply the same thing to all of the images, whatever camera they're from, whatever types of images, whatever the settings, and so I simply choose this preset, click on that. Now they've all been set to be processed the same way, and I can export them, and I'll export them as DNG files. I've got a choice here. I can export them as DNG, TIFF or JPEGs. Well, I want to keep as much information as possible, and that means using TIFF or DNG. I've taken to using DNG because it doesn't fix the white balance in the same way that TIFF does. I may mention that if I remember a bit later on when we're looking at Lightroom or Silky Pics. And I can just click on the export button and the whole lot will be exported. Now it will take about, on this PC, about 40 seconds per per image for RW2 files from my Panasonic cameras, or that's from my FZ200. It will take longer on my little Panasonic travel camera because the pictures have 18 megapixels as opposed to 12 with the FZ200, and the Canon images, which are 20 megapixels, take something around a minute ago. So obviously if I'm actually processing a couple hundred images, which sometimes I am, even after a preliminary selection, I have to go away and do something else, or do some browsing or whatever if I want to use the PC at the same time. And DxO is well behaved, and you can use the PC for other things while it is doing its processing. Let's have a look at what this preset actually does. So I've applied a preset, and if we have a look over here on the right, we can see what it's doing. It's doing this smart lighting, and that gets the exposure to a fairly sensible level. And again, with all these things, you can decide how much of it to apply. And I'm applying a fairly modest amount of most of these things where I'm using them. I'm applying a very small amount of shadows. Some of this thing called clear view, which is a clarity type operation, micro contrast enhancement sort of thing, except that there's also micro contrast enhancement. So I'm not quite sure what the difference is between this micro contrast and clear view, but I've found it useful to use a bit of both. It's doing automatic vignetting correction, and then for the noise reduction it's using DxO's prime noise reduction, which is my main reason for using it, because I find that really good. It's also doing this lens softness, which is it counteracts, it's lens specific because they've done tests on the individual lenses, and it again helps sharpen up images. It's dealing with chromatic aberration and distortion. Oh, this is barrel and pincushion distortion. It's not perfect with this. With Panasonic cameras, or certainly my FZ200, it gets this wrong for wide angles. Now, as it happens, I don't use wide angles much with the FZ200 because mostly I'm using it with a close-up lens, and you can't use that at very wide angle. So this isn't, and in any case it doesn't notice so much with insects. It's not as if you're dealing with buildings or something where there are straight lines that you can see aren't straight, or horizons, for example. So that isn't too much of a problem for me generally, and you can correct it anyway later in Silky Pics or Lightroom if you need to. And that's what the preset does. And as I said, it's the same preset that's applied to all of the images that I've selected for processing by DxO, irrespective of the camera that it came from or anything else to do with the ISO or whatever. So it does make this a sort of a 1 or 2 click operation, even if there are hundreds of files to deal with. I end up with some DNG files, and here I've got a mixture of, for each raw file I've got a DNG file, and in this case I've put the DNGs in the same folder as the raw files. Obviously I could put them in a separate one if I wanted to. Now I'm going to use Silky Pics or Lightroom. Which one? Well, I've done quite a lot of comparisons, and I haven't fully made up my mind yet, but I'm inclining towards using Silky Pics more and more. Lightroom I like using. I find it easy to understand what's going on, easy to get to do what I want. I think its local adjustments are quite nice. On the other hand, it's a drag that you have to import the files before you can do anything to them, and that can be a bit of a bore. On the other hand, Silky Pics, although it's more difficult to use, more difficult to understand what's going on, does seem to produce, for me, better results in areas that I care about. The detail rendition, I find I can do better than I can with Lightroom. It retains colour better in highlights, and I think the overall tonal rendition is more pleasing to my eye. On the other hand, I use some quite aggressive sharpening to bring out the detail, and I can bring out more than I can get out of Lightroom, but there's a side effect, which is that the backgrounds have a low level, sometimes not visible, but sometimes just a bit visible enough to be troublesome. Some artifacts, it looks a bit like noise, and we'll come back to that later on. If we have a look at Lightroom, look in this directory, and I've got one here to play with. So we've got these DNG files, and we've got a mixture of DNG and RAW files here, and what I can do is to pick just the DNG files, which makes it easier. Now, when I'm processing one of these, and this is a copy of one of the DNG files, you'll notice some of these are a different colour. We'll see why that is in a minute, because this is a folder full of images that I've already processed. So I've made a copy of one of them. And the first thing I do when I come to this directory and have selected the DNG files, in fact I select all of them, and I apply a preset to them, and it's the same preset that I apply the whole time, this raw post DxO adjustment one. I won't actually do it because that will overwrite all the adjustments that I've made to them. So I'll go back to my copy of one of them that I've got to play with here, and I will apply, that's already had this preset applied to it. So if I say I want to develop that, now what I like about Lightroom is that this what's called the basic section has highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, and I can understand what these do. If I want to, for instance with the shadows, if I want to turn the shadows up, make them brighter, I can go one way, and if I want to make the shadows darker, I go the other way. And I can do that with the highlights and also with the whites and the blacks being the very brightest areas and the very darkest areas, and there's a nice clarity slider that I can turn the clarity up and down and so on. So I find it very easy to use with these basic functions. And also you've got these graduated filters which I think work rather nicely, so that, for example, that corner up there is looking a bit dark, and so I can make it brighter, and that works, I think, really smoothly. And you can alter, instead of a gradient like that, you can alter a particular area and do things to it. So for example, if I do something silly to this, turn the saturation up in that area, you can see the effect. So that's quite flexible and very easy to use. Also, the way it does sharpening is, I think, is quite nice. That if we look at, it's got this masking, so the bits that are in white are the bits that are going to be sharpened, so you can avoid it sharpening the background, and so producing noise in the background of the sort that's troublesome with Silky Pics. And Silky Pics doesn't have this masking feature, which is a pity. And so you can then just turn the sharpening up and down. And again, the sharpening is very simple to use. You can decide how much of it to use. You can decide on the radius, which is sort of the size of the things which are going to be affected, and you can use the detail slider to bring out more detail, although it won't bring out as much as Silky Pics does, but it's pretty easy to use. There's also an adjustment brush, and there's nothing like this in Silky Pics, where you can, for example, suppose for the sake of argument, again this is another silly one, if I just turn the exposure up in a particular area. Now that's obviously a silly thing to do, but it's actually quite a flexible tool. And as with the gradients, you've got quite a range of things that you can alter if you want to. That's the exposure I've turned back down. I could turn the clarity up in that area, which hasn't made a huge amount of visible difference. I could bring the highlights down in the chosen area. And you can use a combination of those. So it's really quite a powerful tool, and it's the same with these graduated filters and the circular ones, that you can decide what range of differences you want to make to the area concerned. And it's also, the feathering is very nicely done, so it's often impossible to see the join between the area that's being affected and the area that isn't. So if I'm using Lightroom, I go through them all, and I may be doing some selection at this point as well. And for the ones that I think, yes, okay, I'll probably use those, I can set them to be a particular color. And then I can select all the ones of that particular color. And so if I pick the red ones, and I can now export these as TIFF files rather than JPEGs, because I may want to be doing more to them later. So I don't commit to JPEG yet. I keep them as TIFF so I can keep the detail. The alternative to this, if we go back to here, is to use DxO Optics Pro and Silky Pics. So if we look at Silky Pics now, I've got quite possibly the same set of images, and what I've done in Silky Pics, I can't select just the DNG files, which is a bit of a bore. But what I can do is to sort them, and I've sorted them, and that's not sorting. I can sort them with the extension first and then the file name. So what this does is that I've got two sorts of RAW files here. Some are Canon CR2 files and some are Panasonic RW2s, and the DNGs are .dng. So if I sort them like this, it starts out with the Canon RAW files, which are the first row and a bit. Then you get all the DNGs, and at the bottom end you get all the Panasonic RW2s. So I can now select the DNG files, and I have to look around a bit to find out where the end of them is, and it's down here. And now I can do something similar to what I did in Lightroom and apply a preset. In this case it's called loading some development parameters, and I can choose which parameters to load. Now I apply the same parameters to all of them. And again, like with Lightroom, this is my starting point. I'm just getting the image to a nice state that I find good to work on, and then go through on an image by image basis. Now, in comparison to the basics in Lightroom, things get more difficult in Silky Pics. You've got exposure, which is fair enough, but you've got this strange combination of dodging and burning and HDR, and it's quite difficult to get your head round. I had to take some time over this and do quite a lot of experiments. And also the sharpening is more complicated. It's got several sorts of sharpening, and it's got these strange parameters that you can use sliders for, and again I had to experiment quite a lot with this. You can also use some local adjustments, like it has got the graduated filters. It calls them something slightly different, but it's the same idea, and you can alter, for example, the brightness in the same way that I did in Lightroom, but it's very limited as to what you can do. In Lightroom I had a whole list of things like highlights and shadows and saturation and so on. Here I've got saturation and lightness and contrast, and apart from hue, which I've never used, that's all. And you can change the white balance as well. Not nearly as useful as in Lightroom. Can sometimes be okay. Once I've applied the or gone through and I've adjusted them, and again, like with Lightroom, I'm doing selection, you'll see that some of these have got a blue marker on them. In this case I marked them as blue as I went through, deciding yeah I'll have that one, and at that point I can then select the blue ones, and as with Lightroom I can then export, or it's called develop, in if I select them all I can then go to this batch develop, and I can output them as TIFF files to work on. The next step is local adjustments. Now I might already have done some in, depending on what I'm using, Silky Pics or Lightroom. For more complicated things, for example for cloning, neither Lightroom nor Silky Pics are really very good for cloning. Lightroom's a bit better than Silky Pics, but not nearly as good as Elements and Photoshop. It's a very old version of Photoshop that I've got. So I could open up a file that I want to work on. It's a TIFF file now that I'm working on, and open it up in Elements or CS2. And I might, for example, if I wanted to use layers, I very rarely do, but if I did, again, I could use either of those in that case, depending on exactly what I wanted to do. What isn't so rare is the noise. Now, and that's where Define comes into it. This is one of the Nick collection applications which are now free from Google. So if we look at a set of images, here we've got the set of TIFF images that I've produced. In this case I can see that they were produced from Silky Pics, because I can see from the file name it's got SP7 at the end of it. This is a set that I processed recently, and these ones down here all had noisy backgrounds. So I've got a copy of one of them here to play with. Again, I don't want to play with one of the ones that I've actually processed. So what I do here, if I just clear everything out of the way and go back to Faststone. So here's my copy that I'm going to play with. Now this one, if we have a look, if I go in close, if you look at this, or at the area at the, well, the whole of the top of it, right, left and right, it's got a grainy appearance to it. I hope you'll be able to see that on the video. If I go to the next one, and this is one that's had this noise reduction applied to it, the grain is much less evident, and in fact looking at it at the 1300 pixels high, which is the size that I use, I can't see anything, but it looks smooth to me in the background. So if I go back to the one that's rough looking, what I can do is to drag it across onto the define icon, and now it's really quite simple to get this noise reduction to work. I put down what's called a control point, and I stick it in an area of the type that I want it to apply to, and you may be able to see a circular area, and I'm going to expand that out so it covers the whole image, and I'm going to increase the amount of the reduction that's done. Now, I don't know if you can see, I'll make this bigger to make it easier to see. This is 300% now. And on the left we have how it looked as it came out of, in this case, Silky Pics, and on the right how it looks after the noise reduction has been applied. And again, obviously it looks a bit rough here, but at 300% that's hardly surprising, especially since it's an image that came from a small sensor camera. So if we go back out, when you look at it at normal size, it looks okay to my eye. Now, again, if I go back in at 100%, it may be that, well, this sort of coloured stuff's okay, but there's some brown stuff here which it hasn't worked so well on. So it's very easy to duplicate that control point and simply drag it onto another area. Whoops. To drag it onto another area, and now that brown stuff is noise reduced a bit better than it was before. And again, we can see the difference as you can pull this backwards and forwards. It's very easy to see what's going on. Also, if you're looking at it at the smaller size, then down in the bottom right hand corner you get a divided screen there. So wherever the cursor is on the picture, down in the bottom right hand corner it shows you on the left what it did look like, and on the right what it looks like now. And again, I don't know how evident that's going to be on the video, but it does give a pretty clear view as to, you can just go around, have a look in various places and see if there's some types of area that need another one of these things put down. And then at that point you can click on save. I'm not going to do it. What it actually does is to save back the file with the same file name in the same place, so you're overwriting it. Now, for the procedure that I'm using, that's fine. That's exactly what I want. It means I don't have to mess around trying to find the directory to put it into and click lots of buttons. It's just that one button, save. If I did want to do noise reduction and have it saved as a separate file, then I'd have to load up Elements and put the image, the TIFF image, into Elements, and at that point run define from within Elements, at which point when I come to save it I'll be given the option of changing the name and changing where it is. But for my purposes, this one button save and replace the version that's there works a treat. If I make a mistake, I can regenerate the TIFF file from Silky Pics. It's really not a problem. So we now come on to this JPEG production. Up to now I've been using, well, I started with RAW, then I went to DNG, then now I've been using TIFF. And I want to finalize this, and I want to have a good look at the images to make sure that they actually look okay when they are JPEGs, which is the format that I'm going to output them in. And I may also do a bit more selection at this point. And for this I use XNView to have a look at them. Now, the first thing, sorry, before I do that, I have to create the JPEG files. So here in Faststone, I'm in the folder that contains a load of TIFFs that I've now got out of Silky Pics, that I might have edited with Elements or something else, that I might have used Define on to deal with noise in the background. And now I want to create JPEG files from these 1300 pixels high. So in Faststone I can do a batch conversion, and I pick the folder where I want to put them, and I've already got it set up to make them 1300 pixels high, and I change the name, so I add 1300H onto the end of the name, and I click convert, and it then produces these JPEGs which are 1300 pixels high, and I want to see if they're any good. Now I could look through them in Faststone, but I don't. This is where I use XNView. And the reason I use XNView rather than Faststone is that XNView deals with the colours properly. It's colour managed. Faststone says that it's colour managed, but it doesn't handle the colours properly. So when I look at them here in XNView, I'm seeing them as they look in a colour managed application like, say, Lightroom or Silky Pics. So I'm seeing what someone else will see if they've got a calibrated monitor like I'm using, and they're using an application like XNView which does proper colour management. So I go through them and I decide whether they look good enough to keep, and I also look for duplicates or near duplicates, and if they're too similar to one another, I'll throw one or other of the similar ones out. Now what I've got here, if you know, these are actually in the order that the images were captured, because these are in file name order. But at this point that doesn't matter, that's fine. I just go through and I'm looking at each image on its own merits and deciding whether to throw any out on quality grounds. At that point I can then go back to Faststone and do some other operations where it doesn't matter about the image quality. I do things like, for example, these here I want to be in the order of from the smallest to the biggest, so I can rearrange them and put them in an order that suits me, and sometimes I'll move images around so that the similar ones are together, or just there's some arrangement that I prefer to have them in. At this point I'm going to rename these. Now while I'm looking in XNView, or while I'm doing this reordering of them, again I may decide to throw some out. I mean, when I'm putting them in order like this, that's when I discover I've got two that are too similar to one another to want to use. Now some people would say, well, I've got too many there anyway, those are too similar to one another, but obviously that's where personal judgment comes into this. So the next thing is that I want to name these, and I have a spreadsheet, and for each set of images that I deal with I give it a number and a title, and I'm now going to apply that number to each of these images. So I select them all, and I'll try that again. I select them all and I say that I want to rename them. Now I'm going to put a number at the beginning, and then the hash is going to go 01, 02, 03 and so on. I very often put the date in that the pictures were taken, and then that star means and all the rest. So what I then end up with is if I go and look somewhere else, I end up with a set of images like this, with these file names with the sequence and the set number in them, and then the sequence number within the set, the date, and the rest of the file name, and 1300H on the end, because that's how tall they are. Now I need to put these somewhere, and here we come to the second organization of folders. The first one up here was to do with ones that I haven't yet processed and ones that I'm in the middle of processing. Now we come to ones which are processed, and they're organized by these set numbers. And here are the ones that I've just processed, and I create a folder here to put them into, and then copy them from up here where I've renamed them into here. And I also put, for each of the JPEG files that I've created, and these are the ones I'm going to keep, I go back and I get the raw file, and I put the raw file in here as well. And I do that by using 3 copies of Windows Explorer, and in one of them I put the new folder. So in the left hand one I put the new folder where I'm going to put them. On the right hand one I have the list of the JPEGs that I've created, which have the file names, the original file names in them, and in the middle I put the folder that's got the raw files, and then I go through marking up the ones that the raw files that match the JPEGs that are in this list, and then I can put those raw files across into the target directory where I'm going to keep both the raw files and the JPEGs that are derived from them. At that stage I then make a backup copy. I plug in a backup drive, and I copy this folder here with the selected raw and the JPEG images across to the other drive, and I also copy across a copy of the spreadsheet, so I've got a backup copy of that straight away. And then I mark up the folder that it's come from with this P and UL, which means processed and uploaded. I haven't actually uploaded it yet, but I will immediately afterwards I've done this. And so on the backup drive and on here I mark them both up as processed and uploaded. This means that if we go back and look at a previous month, you'll see almost all of these have got processed and uploaded on them. At some point I'm going to delete them. These folders are pretty big because they've got TIFF files in them, DNG files, both of which are much bigger than the raw files that they were derived from, and the raw files are bigger than JPEGs. So these folders get pretty big. But I like to leave them around for a bit because I might want to go back. Perhaps I've posted some stuff, somebody asked a question or whatever, and I want to go back and see what settings I use to process something. So I leave things around for a while. Then every now and then I do a big clear up, and I can simply go through these and delete any of these folders. I know that I've got everything that I decided to keep down here in this other structure. So it's a case of just getting rid of these when the disk begins to get a bit full. Then, when I've made my backup copy and I've disconnected my backup drive, both from the data connection and the electrical connection, so if there's a lightning strike, hopefully it will be okay, I then go back to here and I select the JPEGs and I upload those to Flickr and put them in an album at Flickr with the same name as I've used down here. And that completes the process. So there's a lot to it, and it probably sounds dreadfully complicated. It is quite complicated, but it's surprisingly quick to do, considering that I may start with 1,000 images. I can get through them with this process quite fast. Now, some of the time I have to leave the machine working, especially for the DxO Optics Pro stage, where it might be working, if there's a lot of files, it might be working for 2 or 3 hours. But that's okay, that's not taking any of my time. And I find that this process is broken up into manageable chunks. I find that it can it produces results that I quite like a lot of the time. So there we are. That's it. That's my post-processing workflow and the products that I use. And that's all for now. Goodbye.